Welcome to another episode of Nebraska Farmcast, produced by the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm Ryan Evans, and on this episode, we're talking estate planning, a critical issue for farm and ranch families, as we know. But what happens when assets are being divided unequally? It's a delicate and sometimes uncomfortable conversation, but one that's important to keeping harmony in the family while looking to the future. Anastasia Meyer is an extension agricultural economist with the Center for Ag Profitability, and she has a new article on how to best communicate estate plans to family members when assets are divided unequally. She's joining me to discuss strategies for how they can handle these conversations and plan ahead for a smooth transition. Anastasia, thanks for being here again.
Thanks for having me.
So first, can you just start with explaining why it's important to distinguish between the terms estate planning and transition when those are so often used interchangeably?
Yeah, I can sure do that. Transition planning encompasses four critical components: business planning, estate planning, retirement planning, and succession planning. So estate planning uses legal tools to ensure the next generation inherits assets when the owners retire or pass away. By blending all four components, it prepares for the transfer of ownership, but also facilitates a smooth handover of management responsibilities, while also ensuring that the owners can retire if they so wish.
And you've written about family communication when dividing assets unequally during the estate planning process. And we've got that article linked in the notes to this podcast. It's on our Center for Ag Profitability website as well at cap.unl.edu. So what are some reasons why estate plans would divide things unequally, even if it might not seem like a fair thing to do to all the kids or other potential heirs?
Yeah. So it could range from a multitude of different aspects going on in each kid's or heir's lives. From differences in financial need, maybe one child has a greater financial need than the other, more children, medical bills. It could be that that child is financially irresponsible, and so you don't want your assets to go to them. It could be sweat equity or contribution. So maybe one child has been more involved in the family farm, has reinvested their money back into the farm and has grown it, but it's tied in with mom and dad's estate. So it needs to be adjusted accordingly there. It could also be contribution of end of life care, going to those doctor's appointments, keeping them out of a nursing home. Those are all very time consuming and should be reflected in an estate plan if one child is doing significantly more work than the other. And it could also just be previous financial support. If a parent chose to pay for one child's education and received significant financial assistance during that time or in a different point in time in a lifetime, maybe they helped buy a house or pay for a wedding and the other children did not get the equal compensation or contributions in their lifetime, maybe that's adjusted at the end of the life for the parents and it is reflected an unequal estate planning or transition planning division of assets.
Your article walks through some steps that can be helpful in minimizing potential tension as these plans about unequal division of assets are communicated in families. And that starts with choosing the right moment to share these plans, as you wrote. So how can families pick the right time and the right environment, because that's important too, as you mentioned, to discuss these sensitive topics?
So I always recommend that you try to communicate your plans when there's no heightened emotions already at play. You don't want to wait to discuss it until a big life event happens. Maybe you're grieving something, whether it's a loss of a piece of land, somebody you love, whatever grief there might be. That's probably not a good time. We want to avoid those situations. We also want to avoid any times like holiday meals. You don't want to bring up these conversations at Christmas, at Thanksgiving. I always recommend people pick a neutral site. The neutral site is just as important as a neutral day. So we're going to avoid any major holidays, but we're also going to avoid meeting at mom or dad's or grandma and grandpa's kitchen table. When we go to the kitchen table, everybody falls into their typical roles and power dynamics are at play. So maybe mom is going around meeting everybody's needs, getting them coffee, tea, playing grandma or mom. Dad sits at the head of the table. He puts on his dad hat. I am the power of the household. I make all the decisions. And sometimes it's really hard to break the mentality that the person wanting to come back to the farm is no longer that 15-year-old that is just hired labor. So pick a site where nobody has any power dynamics at play. That could be a library, that could be at your local extension office. When you pick a site like this, there's no power at play, but it also limits distractions. If somebody gets frustrated, they're not going to just walk out and start doing chores on the farm or ranch. With family meetings like this, when you're having these hard conversations, I think it is really important to emphasize that we are going to respect everybody and give them time to talk. Knowing my own personal family, we're a very loud family. And so my family, I might consider a talking stick that you can't talk unless you have that stick because that physical thing may be needed to ensure that everybody gets a chance to voice their concern. And it's really a struggle, but you have to force yourself to listen.
And if there is still a risk of those group meetings getting too emotional, like you said, people know their own families, what those risks are there other communication strategies that might help to diffuse that emotionally charged environment in a family conversation?
So remember that farming and ranching is a lifestyle as well as a business. And a lot of times we as farmers and ranchers have a hard time separating out those aspects of life. So we have to acknowledge that emotions are going to be stirred up from anger, disappointment, jealousy, and that comes from that lifestyle aspect. This is a way we grew up. We have those emotional ties to it. So try to validate everybody's emotions by expressing that it is difficult to comprehend, and it likely wasn't an easy decision. But you also need to state that you believe that this is fair, and you need to stand and be firm in your decision. Encourage that open communication, but set boundaries to avoid the endless debates that just go round and round and never come to anything but just cause more tension. The good news is, if you listen to these concerns and you decide, yes, something needs to be changed and adjusted, well, then you can make those adjustments at a later date.
Another really interesting thing you wrote about in this article is considering using written communication in addition to face-to-face conversations, that this written communication can potentially provide clarity, hopefully present misinterpretations of intentions down the road. So how can farm and ranch families effectively combine both approaches with written communication and face-to-face to help just ensure that transparency and understanding?
As we mentioned earlier, emotions are going to be high during these conversations. So your recollection of the event may be different from somebody else's. Discussion points that you remember is might be different from somebody else's. So by taking your decision and writing it down, it allows the heirs to go back and refer to that written explanation to make sure that your intentions are there in the future and can be held up. It reduces any misunderstandings, some wrong recollections, and just really provides that clarity for the future. And it provides the opportunity for your heirs to look back at that document and maybe ask questions that they didn't think of in the heat of the moment, when it was first getting introduced to them.
That's really good. And along those lines of kind of helping heirs who might be receiving less than others to feel better or feel comfortable with the situation when assets are being divided unequally? Are there other steps or strategies that people can use in the estate planning process to help put them at ease a little bit more?
Well, the first question is, are there enough assets to separate out from the business versus personal? A lot of times when things are divided unequally, maybe one heir and will get the farm or ranch business assets, or maybe they get the land, tractor, something like that. But maybe there is a life insurance policy or cash sitting, and the other heirs get a portion of that. If your farm and ranch is successful enough that they don't have to have all of that, all of those assets, you could break it into that way. Another way to do this is to ask those heirs, what do you want? It could be the fact that maybe the heirs don't want cash. They don't want any of the farm assets because they never really enjoyed farming or they were not a part of it and they understand why the division is unequal. But maybe they really want that family photo album that, is a lifelong treasure. Or maybe they want grandma's pie plate that was carried over when they immigrated over here. Maybe those non-monetary items that they have a lot of sentimental attachment to, maybe those could go to the other heirs. And they would feel good and have a fairness about it.
Last thing before we wrap up, you've been talking about transparency and honesty and how those can go so far and really do a lot of good in these conversations. As uncomfortable as they are, we hear all the time about situations where no estate planning or poor estate planning can really divide families for years or even lifetimes. So what's your advice to farmers and ranchers who are apprehensive, whether that's because of the awkward conversations or other reasons, all the work involved, who are apprehensive about starting or continuing the estate planning process?
But my first advice is always just to have that open and transparent communication as well with the documentation. It ensures that your family understands what your intentions are and also have them feel valued. When those tough decisions are involved, honesty, clarity, and empathy goes a long ways at preventing any misunderstandings and family disputes. So I think the big thing is just making sure that everybody is respecting each other and keeping the doors open for questions. Nothing disrails a transition process more than saying this is the way it is and that's the end of it. If people have questions, they need to know who to ask to, why these decisions were made. And as simple as it sounds, but they need to know who to be mad at. If the goal of family harmony is there and they want to continue on Christmases even long after you are past, if the kid is mad at you, that's one thing. But if the kid is mad at their siblings because the surprise shocked them and that isn't how they thought that the family breakout was going to happen, that shouldn't be on your kid's responsibility.
Well, as always, great information from Anastasia Meyer, an extension educator and agricultural economist with the Center for Ag Profitability here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And you can find her new article on just what we've been talking about here today, some strategies to help preserve that family harmony when you're communicating estate plans that might be dividing assets unequally. That's on our website, cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu. It's also linked to in the podcast notes for this. So I want to thank Anastasia very much for joining us, and thank you for listening. Nebraska Farmcast is a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. For the latest research-based information and education resources to manage your farm or ranch operation, visit our website at cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu.